The dust rose in thin, choking veils from the cracked earth clinging to her skirts like the ghosts of promises long broken. Eliza staggered along the rutted trail, her boots worn thin as paper, each step a fire in her blistered feet. The sun hung low over the Wyoming plains, a bloated orange eye, indifferent to the weight she carried. The two small children clutched to her sides, their faces smeared with grime and silent tears. Mary, the older one at 5 years, gripped her mother's hand with fingers that trembled like aspen leaves in the wind. Tom, barely 3, whimpered softly against her hip, his small body a feverish bundle in the fading light. The wagon had broken miles back. Axles snapped clean under the strain of their meager belongings, and now the world stretched empty before them, a sea of sagebrush and shadowed hills that offered no mercy. Her throat burned raw from thirst, and the ache in her chest was more than hunger. It was the hollow echo of loss. John had been gone 6 months now, taken by the fever that swept through their homestead like a thief in the night. Left her with debts she couldn't pay, land she couldn't till, and these two little ones who looked at her with eyes too old for their faces. She'd sold what she could, bundled the rest, and set out for the only name she knew, a rancher in these parts, whispered about in the saloons back in Cheyenne, as a man who might take pity on the desperate. But pity was a thin thread, and Eliza felt it fraying with every labored breath. She collapsed to her knees at last, the ground hard and unyielding beneath her stones, biting into her palm. The children huddled close Mary's hand, stroking her arm in a gesture too maternal for her tender age. Tom's sobs muffled against her faded calico dress. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the distant low of cattle, but no human voice rose to meet it. Eliza closed her eyes, the salt of her own tears mixing with the dust on her lips. Memories flickered unbidden: John's laugh by the fire, rough and warm, the way he'd hoist Tom onto his shoulders, declaring him king of the prairie. But those days were buried now under the weight of unpaid bills and the sheriff's cold gaze. She'd fled before they could take the children, before the whispers of her own shadowed past could catch up the secret she'd buried deeper than any grave. A shadow fell across her, long and sudden, blocking the last slant of sun. She looked up, vision blurred, to see a horse and rider silhouetted against the sky. The man dismounted slowly, his boots crunching the earth, a rifle slung across his back like an old habit. He was tall, weathered by years under this unforgiving sun, his face lined with the quiet scars of a life spent alone. Samuel Harlan, she guessed, though she'd never laid eyes on him. His eyes sharp as flint swept over her and the children, not with judgment, but with the wary caution of a man who'd learned trust was a luxury. You lost. His voice was low, gravel, rough, carrying the lilt of plain speech. Eliza pushed herself up, steadying Mary behind her. Not lost. Looking for work. Heard you might need hands, at your spread. He glanced at the children, then back to her, his jaw tightening faintly. A gust stirred the dust between them, and for a moment the world held its breath. Samuel rubbed a hand over his stubbled chin, the gesture revealing calluses thick as leather. His own burdens flickered in his eyes, the ranch teetering on the edge, cattle prices plummeting, and the empty house that echoed with the absence of his wife gone. These 4 years to childbirth fever. But he said nothing of that. Instead, he nodded toward his horse. Can't promise much, but there's a bunkhouse and chores enough. Kids can stay out of the way. Relief flooded her sharp as pain, but she masked it with a steady gaze. As he helped lift Tom onto the saddle, his hand brushed hers, rough, warm, and something stirred in the air, fragile as dawnlight. They rode in silence toward the distant outline of his ranch, the plains swallowing their tracks behind them. That first night, under the low roof of the bunkhouse, Eliza lay awake, the children's breathing soft beside her. The wind howled outside, rattling the tin, and she traced the cracks in the wall with her fingers, remembering the letter hidden in her hem, the one that bore Samuel's name, not as employer but as kin to a truth she'd carried across these barren miles. John's last words, whispered in delirium, the boy he'd fathered long ago, given up before they met, now a man alone on this very land. But she pushed the thought down deep as roots in parched soil. Tomorrow would bring work, and with it perhaps a way to unburden the secret without shattering the fragile shelter they'd found. Days blurred into a rhythm of sweat and silence. Eliza rose before dawn, her hands learning the bite of rope and the heft of feed buckets. The ranch sprawled across the valley, fences sagging under neglect, cattle lowing in the corrals like mournful ghosts. Samuel spoke little at first. His instructions clipped mend the wire haul water from the creek that ran thin as a vein. She adapted, her body aching but growing stronger, calluses forming where softness had been. Mary trailed her, collecting eggs from the henhouse with wide-eyed wonder, while Tom played in the dirt, his laughter a rare spark in the quiet. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in bruised purples, Samuel found her by the barn, rubbing liniment into a lame horse's leg. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her steady hands. "You handle 'em well. Where'd you learn back east before?" She trailed off, straightening. The horse nickered softly, nuzzling her palm. He nodded, gaze distant. "Lost my Sarah to the fever. Left me with dreams of a bigger spread, kids running around. But dreams dry up out here like everything else." His voice cracked faintly, a vulnerability slipping through like water through cracked earth. Eliza felt a pull, an echo of her own grief, but she said nothing, only passed him the brush. They worked side by side as dusk fell, the air thick with the scent of hay and horseflesh, a tentative bridge forming in the shared labor. Weeks passed, marked by the slow turning of seasons on the high plain. The first hard frost came early, silvering the grass at dawn and turning breath to white smoke. Eliza learned the ranch in pieces, the way the wind funneled down the draw behind the house, carrying the scent of pine from the distant ridges, the rhythm of milking the two thin Jersey cows whose udders hung low and warm against her cold fingers, the small private satisfaction of seeing a fence line stand straight after hours of straining wire and driving posts. Her hands cracked and bled, then toughened. She no longer flinched at the sting of lye soap or the kick of a cow's hoof grazing her shin. Mary grew bolder, following Samuel when he checked the herd, her small boots leaving prints beside his larger ones. Tom clung less, toddling after chickens with a stick he called a saw. Samuel watched them all from a distance, at first, then closer. He began leaving extra bread on the table after supper, thick slices slathered with the last of the summer jam. One morning he found Eliza struggling to split kindling, the axe too heavy for her tired arms. Without a word, he took it from her, split the pile in a dozen clean strokes, then handed her the handle again. "Keep your elbows in," he said. "Saves your back." She nodded, cheeks warming despite the cold. That evening he stayed longer at the bunkhouse door, leaning there while she mended a tear in Tom's shirt by lamp. The children slept already, curled together under the one good quilt. Samuel's shadow stretched long across the plank floor. "You ever think of going back east?" he asked quietly. Eliza kept her eyes on the needle. "Nothing left there but graves and debts. And people who'd sooner see me in the poorhouse than help." He shifted his weight. "Out here a person can start over. If they're willing to work." She met his gaze then. The lamplight caught the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the one he never explained. "I'm willing," she said. Something passed between them, then wordless and careful, like two animals circling the same waterhole testing for danger. The softening came in small gestures. He taught Mary how to loop a lariat, standing behind her with patient hands guiding hers until the rope sang through the air and dropped over a post. He carved Tom a wooden horse from a scrap of cedar, its legs sturdy, its mane etched with the point of his knife. When the boy clutched it to his chest and whispered, "Mine," Samuel's throat worked once hard before he looked away. Eliza noticed the photographs on the mantel in the main house, faded tintypes of a younger Samuel beside a woman with laughing eyes and a baby blanket folded in her arms. She never asked. But one night, after a long day of branding strays, he sat on the porch steps with a tin cup of coffee gone cold. She joined him without invitation, wrapping her shawl tighter against the wind. "Sarah wanted more children," he said after a long silence. "Thought we'd fill this valley with them. Then the fever came. Took her and the boy both. Left me rattling around in a house too big for one." Eliza rested her chin on her drawn-up knees. "John talked about more children, too. Said we'd build something lasting." She paused. "He never got the chance." Samuel turned the cup in his hand. "Sometimes I think the land takes more than it gives." "Sometimes," she agreed, "but not always." Their eyes met and held. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, rattling leaves like dry paper. Neither moved closer. Neither moved away. Trust grew the way grass returns after fire, slow, stubborn, rooted deep. She began cooking supper in the main house instead of the bunkhouse. He began mending the porch rail she'd complained about. They spoke of small things, the price of beef in Cheyenne, the way the creek iced over too early this year, which Mari might full first come spring. Yet beneath the ordinary words ran a current neither named. One afternoon, while Samuel was gone to town for supplies, Eliza found the letter again. She had kept it hidden in the hem of her spare dress, folded small as a secret. John's shaky hand written in the last days of the fever. Samuel Harlan is kin to you now, though he don't know it. The boy I gave up before we met, he's grown running a spread north of Cheyenne. If anything happens to me, take the young'uns there. He's good people. He'll do right. Her fingers trembled as she read it again. The children played outside, their voices thin and bright against the vast quiet. She pressed the paper to her lips, tasting ink and old grief. The secret had ridden with her across 200 miles of dust and heartbreak. Now, it sat heavy in her chest, waiting for the moment it would either bind them or break them apart. When Samuel returned that evening, dust on his hat and a sack of flour across his shoulder, he found her standing at the stove stirring beans that did not need stirring.
She looked at him, really looked, and something in her face made him pause in the doorway.
Everything all right? He asked. She swallowed. I need to tell you something. He set the sack down slowly. The room felt smaller, suddenly the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and coming confession. Samuel stood motionless in the doorway, the sack of flour still balanced on his shoulder like an afterthought. The lamplight flickered across his face, carving deeper shadows into the lines around his mouth. Outside, the wind had died to a low moan, leaving the night unnaturally still. Eliza set the wooden spoon down. Her fingers left damp prints on the handle. It's about John, she said. And you. He lowered the sack to the floor with deliberate care, the thud soft against the boards. Then he crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled out a chair, not sitting, just resting his hands on the back of it, as though he needed something solid. Go on. She drew a breath that tasted of wood smoke and fear. He spoke of you before he died. Not by name at first. Said there was a boy he'd given up years ago before we met. A boy raised by kin somewhere north of Cheyenne. He said if anything happened to him, I should come here. To you. Samuel's knuckles whitened on the chair. The room seemed to shrink around them, the fire in the stove popping once like a warning. He never told me the whole of it, she continued, voice steady now, because it had to be. Only that the child was his. Born out of wedlock. Given away so the mother could marry proper. John carried it like a stone in his chest all the years we were together. Never spoke of it except when the fever had him half out of his mind. He said, your name then? Samuel Harlan. Said you were good people. Said you'd do right by his young'uns if the time came. The silence stretched thin and sharp. Samuel stared at the floorboards between them as though answers might be written there in the grain. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, scraped raw. You're telling me those children, he lifted his eyes to hers, searching, are my blood half? She said quietly. Tom and Mary. John's by blood. Yours by what he carried, by what he asked me to bring here. He exhaled through his nose, a sound that might have been pain or disbelief or both. He turned away, walked to the window, and stood, looking out at the dark where the corrals lay invisible now. His shoulders rose and fell once slowly. I was 16, he said after a long minute. She was 15. Her folks sent her away to have the baby. I never saw him. Never knew if it was a boy or girl. They told me it was gone, adopted out clean. I believed them because I was young and scared and wanted to believe I hadn't ruined 2 lives. He rubbed the back of his neck. Never thought the trail would lead back here. Eliza stayed where she was, hands folded tight in her apron. I didn't come to claim anything. I came because we had nowhere else. Because the bank was taking the claim, because the children were hungry, because John's last words were your name. I meant to work for you, pay our way, keep quiet. But the longer we stayed, the heavier it got. He turned back to her. The lamplight caught the wet gleam in his eyes, though no tears fell. You carried that alone. All these weeks, I carried worse, she said. Losing him, watching them lose him. This, this was just one more weight. Samuel crossed the room again, slower this time. He stopped a pace away. They're good children. Bright. Kind. They've got his laugh, Tom especially. I heard it the first week and couldn't place why it hurt so much. Eliza swallowed. I'm sorry. Don't be. He reached out, hesitated, then laid his hand on her forearm light, careful the way he'd touch a skittish colt. You brought them here. You kept them safe. That's more than most would done. She looked down at his hand, rough and warm against her sleeve. Something loosened inside her chest, a knot she hadn't known was there. Not forgiveness, not yet, but permission to breathe. They stood like that until the fire settled to coals. Then Samuel stepped back, cleared his throat. We'll talk more tomorrow. When the young uns are awake, they deserve to know too, in pieces they can carry. She nodded. In pieces. He lingered another moment, then moved toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. You're not leaving, Eliza. Not unless you want to. This place has room. Always did. The door closed softly behind him. She listened to his boots cross the porch, heard the creak of the steps as he went down into the dark. Then she sank into the chair he'd pulled out, laid her head on her arms, and let the quiet tears come not from grief this time, but from the strange aching relief of no longer carrying the secret alone. The next morning broke cold and clear. Frost rimmed every blade of grass, and the sky was the pale blue of new milk. Mary and Tom woke early, clamoring for oatmeal. Eliza moved through the familiar motions, stoking the stove, measuring cornmeal, pouring water, while her mind turned over the night before, like a stone smoothed by a river. Samuel appeared at the kitchen door, just as she set the bowls on the table. He carried an armload of split wood, set it by the box without speaking, then took off his hat and hung it on the peg. Mary looked up at him with her usual shy smile. Tom waved his spoon like a flag. Morning, Samuel said. His voice was steady, but his eyes flicked to Eliza, first asking silent permission. She gave the smallest nod. He pulled out a chair and sat. Got something to tell you, too, he began, folding his hands on the table. Something about family. The children stilled, spoons hovering. Outside, a crow called once harsh and lonely. Then the wind took the sound away. Samuel's voice stayed low, measured the way he spoke to a horse that might bolt. Your pa, John, he was my father, too. Long time ago, before he met your ma. He was young, made a hard choice. Gave me up so I could have a better start. I grew up not knowing him, thinking my folks were the ones who raised me. But blood don't lie, and neither did the way Tom's laugh sounded in my ears like an old song I'd forgot. Mary's spoon rested against the rim of her bowl. Her dark eyes moved between Samuel and her mother, searching for the lie that wasn't there. Tom, too young to grasp the weight, only sensed a shift in the air. He reached out and patted Samuel's big hand where it lay flat on the table. You're our Grandpa, Mary, asked the word, small and careful, testing its shape. Samuel's mouth quirked, not quite a smile. Something like that. More like kin that got lost and found again. Doesn't change what we've been doing these past weeks. You've been helping with chores, eating at my table, sleeping safe under my roof. That's family too. The kind you choose every day. Eliza watched the children absorb it. Mary's brow furrowed, thinking hard the way she did when puzzling out a knot in yarn. Tom simply nodded, satisfied, and returned to his oatmeal, smearing a streak of it across his cheek. I always wanted a brother or sister, Mary said after a moment. Mama said maybe someday. But this is different. It is, Samuel agreed. Different don't mean bad. He looked at Eliza, then a silent question in his eyes. Was this enough? Had he said it right? She gave him the smallest lift of her chin, gratitude and something warmer threading through it. The morning moved on in its ordinary way, dishes, washed coats, buttoned against the frost boots thumping across the porch. But the air felt lighter, as though a long-held breath had been released. Samuel took the children to check the ice on the stock tank, showing them how to break it with the axe handle, so the cattle could drink. Eliza watched from the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, the cold biting her cheeks. Mary laughed when a chip of ice flew and struck Tom's mitten. Samuel steadied the boy when he slipped on the frozen ground. Simple gestures, yet they carried the slow certainty of roots taking hold. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, dust trailing him like smoke. Eliza recognized the bay-gelding first Sheriff Harlan Samuel's cousin by marriage, though the two men rarely spoke beyond nods at the stockyard. The sheriff reined up near the barn, hat pushed back, face grim under the brim. "Samuel," he called. "Need a word." Samuel stepped out from the shadow of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Eliza stayed on the porch, Mary and Tom behind her skirts, sensing the change in the wind. "Got word from Cheyenne," the sheriff said without dismounting. "Bank's foreclosing on the old Whitaker. Place your wife's folks' land, the piece you've been leasing graze on. They're selling it off to the railroad men come spring. Means your herd's got nowhere to winter unless you move 'em fast or buy the parcel outright. And they're asking $3,000 cash. No notes." Samuel's jaw tightened. $3,000 might as well have been $30,000. The ranch scraped by on what the beef brought after shipping, and the last drive had barely covered feed. He glanced toward the house, toward Eliza and the children framed in the doorway like a painting he didn't want to lose. "How long?" he asked. "End of the month. They'll post notice." After that auction, the sheriff tipped his hat, wheeled the bay, and rode out, leaving silence in his wake. Samuel stood a long time staring at the empty trail. When he finally turned back toward the house, his face was unreadable. But Eliza saw the flicker of old defeat in his eyes, the same look she'd worn the day the wagon axle snapped. Inside, she poured coffee neither of them drank. The children had gone to play in the hayloft, their voices muffled and distant. "We'll lose the lease," he said at last. "Means selling off half the herd just to keep the rest fed. Means starting over smaller. Maybe too small to hold." Eliza set her cup down. "Or we fight it." He looked at her, surprised. "I've got nothing left to lose," she said. "But I've got hands, and I know how to work." "So do you. We've got the children, and we've got this place such as it is. If the bank wants to take what's left of Sarah's land, let them try. We'll find another way to graze. Or we'll buy time. Or we'll buy the parcel ourselves." With what his voice was quiet, not cruel. "With whatever we can scrape together. Sell the yearlings early. Take on extra hands for the neighbor's branding. I can sew launder cook for the crews come spring drive. Mary's old enough to help with mending. We'll make it work." He studied her face as though seeing it new. "You'd stay after everything." "I'm not staying for the land," she said. "I'm staying for what's already here." The words hung between them, plain and unguarded. Samuel reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough the warmth crossed the space. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said. "A reason to fight for more than just breathing." "Then fight with me," she answered. He nodded once, decisive. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the tin roof like applause. The days that followed hardened into purpose. Samuel rode out before first light each morning, tallying the herd, marking the yearlings fat enough to sell early. Eliza turned the house into a small industry. She scrubbed the last of the summer linens until they shone, mended every torn shirt and frayed cuff she could find among the hands' belongings, then took in extra work from the neighboring ranches. Women rode over with baskets of torn overalls and faded dresses, paying in coins or butter or a side of bacon. Mary learned to thread needles faster than her mother, her small fingers steady as she hemmed trousers by the window's pale winter light. Tom carried scraps of cloth to the sewing basket, proud of his small importance. Samuel came in one evening, smelling of horse sweat and pine smoke, a ledger tucked under his arm. He spread it open on the kitchen table while Eliza ladled stew into bowls. The figure stared up at them. Cattle sold, wages owed, feed bought on credit, the looming gap where $3,000 should have been. "Got 200 from the yearlings already," he said. "Another 100 promised if the beef holds weight till spring. But it's not enough. Not near." Eliza set the ladle down. "What about the timber claim up on the North Ridge, the one Sarah's father filed before he passed?" Samuel's eyes lifted. "Thought that died with him." Paperwork's buried somewhere in the county office if it's still good. It might be. And timber's worth money. Now the railroad's hungry for ties. We could cut enough to hire a crew for a week, get the cash flowing. He studied her across the steam rising from the stew. That's hard country up there. Steep. Cold. And the claim might vlapsed. Then we check, she said simply. Tomorrow. He didn't argue. Something in her voice, steady, unyielding, reminded him of the way Sarah used to speak when she decided a thing was worth doing. They left at dawn, the children staying behind with the oldest hand's wife, who promised pancakes and stories. Samuel and Eliza rode side by side up the narrow trail, the horses picking careful footing over frost-slick rock. The air grew thinner, sharper, their breath plumed white. Pines stood sentinel along the ridge, dark against the pale sky, and the wind carried the scent of resin and distant snow. At the claim marker, a weathered post half buried in needles, Samuel dismounted and knelt, scraping dirt from the tin plate nailed to the wood. The date was still legible, 1883. Sarah's father's name. The claim had 5 years left if no one had jumped it. Eliza watched him trace the letters with a gloved finger. She loved this place, he said quietly. Used to bring me up here when we were courting. Said the view made her feel small in a good way. Eliza stepped closer, boots crunching. We'll keep it that way. For her. For the children. He rose, dusting his hands. Their eyes met, and the space between them felt charged alive with the same quiet resolve that had carried them this far. He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek where the wind had loosened it. His thumb lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. We'll cut what we can, he said. Sell what we must. And if it's still not enough, we'll find another way. She nodded, throat tight. Together, they marked the best stands of pine that afternoon, counting trunks thick enough for railroad ties. By dusk, their hands were sticky with sap, their faces windburned, but hope had taken root again, small, stubborn green. Word spread slowly through the valley. Neighbors who'd kept their distance began stopping by a sack of potatoes left on the porch, a note offering a team of mules for the timber haul, an old man who'd worked the ridge before offering to guide the crew for board and a share. The community, thin as it was, began to close ranks around them, the way grass knits over bare ground after fire. One evening, after the children were asleep, Samuel found Eliza on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, staring at the stars. He sat beside her on the top step, close enough their shoulders touched. Got a letter from the county today, he said. Claims still ours. No jumps. We can start cutting next week. She exhaled a sound almost like laughter. Then we've got a chance. More than that. He turned to her, the starlight catching the planes of his face. I've been thinking about what comes after. About us. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. I don't want you in the bunkhouse anymore, he said. I want you in the house. In my bed. In my life. Not because of blood or debt or what John left behind. Because I see you, Eliza. Every day. The way you fight for those kids. The way you fight for this place. The way you look at me like I'm worth something more than the dirt under my boots. Tears stung her eyes, sudden and hot. She reached for his hand, their fingers laced together, rough palm to rough palm. I've been afraid, she whispered. Afraid if I let myself want this, it'd be taken away again. I'm afraid too, he admitted. But I'm more afraid of waking up one morning and finding you gone. Of this house, empty again. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The night wind moved soft around them, carrying the faint low of cattle and the scent of pine from the ridge. Then stay, she said. Both of us. All of us. He turned, cupped her face with both hands, and kissed her slow, careful, like a man tasting something he'd thought lost forever. When they parted, foreheads resting together, the future felt less like a gamble and more like a promise carved in the hard earth they stood on. The timber crew arrived the following Monday, 5 men from the valley, weathered and quiet, bringing their own axes, crosscut saws, and a pair of mules Samuel had borrowed for the haul. They camped in the draw below the ridge canvas, stretched between pines, coffee boiling before dawn. Eliza rose with them each morning, packing cornbread and salt pork wrapped in oil, carrying the heavy baskets up the trail, while the children stayed below with the camp cook, an old widower named Amos, who told them stories of the gold camps until their eyes grew wide. The work was brutal. Axes rang against frozen wood, echoes bouncing off the rock faces like gunshots. Samuel swung beside the others, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat freezing on his brow the moment it broke. Eliza learned to swing a lighter maul, splitting smaller limbs for kindling her shoulders, burning palms blistering through her gloves. She did not complain. When a log jammed the chute they'd built, she climbed the icy slope with the men, wedging her body against the timber until it gave tumbling down with a roar that shook snow from the branches overhead. One afternoon, a storm rolled in without warning, gray clouds boiling over the ridge, wind sharp as knives. The crew scrambled to secure the mules. Samuel shouted orders over the howl. Eliza found Mary and Tom huddled in the cook tent, faces pale. She pulled them close, wrapped them in blankets that smelled of wood smoke and mule sweat, and sang the lullaby John used to hum low and steady until the wind's fury dulled to a moan. Samuel appeared at the tent flap, coat crusted with snow, eyes searching until they found her. He stepped inside, crouched, and brushed ice from Tom's hair with a gentleness that made her throat close. "We're buttoned down," he said. "Storm will pass by dark." She nodded. "We'll be all right." He lingered, looking at the three of them tangled together under the quilt. Something shifted in his expression, gratitude perhaps, or the quiet realization that this was what he'd been missing all those empty years. He reached out, touched her cheek where a streak of sap still clung, then bent and kissed her forehead, brief but deliberate, in front of the children and the old cook who pretended not to notice. The storm broke at dusk. Stars appeared cold and brilliant. The crew returned to work the next day as though the blizzard had been a minor interruption. By the end of the second week, they had enough ties stacked and skidded down to the flat enough to bring in $1,200 when the railroad buyer came through more if the grade held. Samuel counted the money twice in the lamplight, then pushed half toward Eliza across the kitchen table. "For the children's future," he said. "School books, clothes, whatever they need." She slid it back. "For the ranch. For all of us." He looked at her a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Together." The bank notice arrived 2 days later, posted on the courthouse door in Cheyenne. Samuel rode in alone to face it, Eliza waiting at home with the children, hands busy but heart pacing the miles. He returned after dark, coat dusted with road dirt, a folded paper in his pocket. "They'll take bids at auction next month," he said, hanging his hat. "But the timber money's in the safe. We've got a shot." She crossed the room and rested her forehead against his chest. His arms came around her, steady as the ridge itself. "We'll bid," she whispered. "And we'll win." The auction day dawned bitter. Snow lay thin on the ground, crunching under boots, as townspeople gathered outside the courthouse. Eliza stood beside Samuel in her best dress, the one she'd mended a dozen times, Mary and Tom between them holding mittened hands. The banker read the terms in a flat voice. Bids climbed slow at first, then stalled. Samuel raised his hand once, twice, voice calm but carrying. When the hammer fell at $2,800, a murmur ran through the crowd. Enough to cover the debt and leave a small margin. They walked out into the pale sunlight, the paper of ownership folded in Samuel's coat. Mary tugged his sleeve. "Does this mean we stay?" He crouched to her level. "Means we stay. Means this land's ours. Yours and Tom's and your ma's. And mine." Tom threw his arms around Samuel's neck, small face buried in the wool collar. Samuel lifted him, held him close, then reached for Eliza's hand. They walked back to the wagon together, 4 shadows stretching long across the snow. That night, after the children slept, Samuel built up the fire until the room glowed warm. He took a small box from the mantel tin, dented the one that had held Sarah's wedding band these many years. Inside lay two plain gold rings worn smooth by time. I kept hers, he said quietly. Thought maybe someday. Eliza looked at the rings, then at him. Tears stood in her eyes but did not fall. He took her left hand, slid the smaller ring onto her finger. It fit as though made for her. Then he offered her the other. She slipped it onto his hand, her touch lingering. No preacher, he said. No crowd. Just us. And the promise we make right here. She nodded. I promise to stand with you, through storm and drought and whatever this land throws next. To love you honest every day. I promise the same, he answered. To keep you and the children safe. To build something lasting. To choose you every morning no matter what. They kissed, then slow and deep, the fire crackling soft approval. Outside the wind moved gentle through the pines carrying the scent of new snow and evergreen. Inside the house felt full, not just of people but of something harder won trust, rebuilt grief, eased a future no longer borrowed but claimed. In the quiet that followed, Eliza rested her head on Samuel's shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Somewhere in the next room, Mary murmured in her sleep. Tom sighed, turning over. The ranch slept around them, fences straight herd, bedded down timber money safe in the strongbox. They had not erased the past. The losses still lived in the empty corners, in the faded photographs, in the ache that came on cold mornings. But they had made room for something new, fragile, yet fierce, rooted deep in the hard Wyoming earth. And tomorrow, the work would begin again. Tell us what you think in the comments here on Romance Trails Wild West.